Welcome to Earth Chapters, brought to you by Pollinator Friendly Alliance. You can find us at pollinatorfriendly.org. Pollinator Friendly Alliance is a grassroots nonprofit powered by the enthusiasm of our partners and volunteers to protect the natural world, pollinators, and their habitats. Remember, everything in the natural world is connected. An ecosystem is a community of living things that work together and rely upon the other. Let's be good stewards of the ecosystem. Today's Earth chapter is Geologic History of the St. Croix River with Jim Almendinger and Early Spring Bees with Heather Holm. So let's get started.
Okay. Well, thanks, Lori. As Lori noted, I'm Jim Almendinger, Director of the St. Croix Watershed Research Station. And I'm going to talk a little bit about today the geology of the St. Croix, its origins. We're going to cover, simple things like how did we get to the current time from the beginning of time? Something, we'll cover very briefly, even though it's billions of years. Where did the ground come from? More mundane things like that. And how did Lake St. Croix form? What was the origin of its form? Where did it start and how did it get there? So the Watershed Research Station, some of you know, I looked over the names as people signed up, and I realized there are old friends in the list, and some of you know this topic better than I do. But we are a private nonprofit environmental research lab on St. Croix River, in Marina St. Croix. We work pretty much wherever we get funding from local, state, and federal agencies. Work all over the country when we can, but nearly all of us really over the state of Minnesota, and a great deal of that's in the St. Croix Valley. So the St. Croix is a great sandbox for us to do our work in. We're a team of independent-minded scientists. We're dedicated to doing the science that helps make our rivers and lakes clean. I like the quote that Margaret Mead gives about small team efforts, but I think they're really important, and that is that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world, and it's the only thing that ever really has changed the world. And I think groups like the Pollinator Friendly Alliance are good examples of that. You're doing the right thing. Good to know. So the geology of the St. Croix. First off, if my microphone is not good, let me know. I'm not sure the volume settings are, but if I need to change something, I'll let Lori let me know. So the geology of St. Croix is born of fire, that is things that come from igneous rocks, water, and ice. So fire, water, and ice. That's Earth, Wind, and Fire was something else. That was a group from the 70s. I think they still exist, but that was some time ago. This is fire, water, and ice. This is a nice depiction of the geologic timescale by the USGS. It's a spiral when you've got to get lots of information onto a small area. And the origin of the universe started 14 billion years ago, to give some context. That's the beginning of, we live in this four-dimensional space and time world, and that was the beginning of both space and time, according to the cosmologists. 2/3 of the way through that, the Earth coalesced out of the gases and dust in our solar system 4.5 billion years ago. And then pretty soon after that, a billion years or so after the start, the first life appeared. And a lot of that was cyanobacteria, blue-green algae. And actually, bacteria, not really an algae, but they started the photosynthesis that pumped oxygen into the environment. That lasted for several billion years, the great oxygenation event. And then most of the life during this time, though, was all unicellular, small, maybe some prototypical multicellular organisms, but not many until what was called the Cambrian explosion at 540 million years ago. That's when multicellular life really took off, and the rocks that contained those could be identified by a geologist. So the first 7/8 of Earth's history was with very simple life forms or no life at all. And wasn't until the Cambrian when we got these multicellular animals that became distinctive and sort of the progenitors for the rest of the life that took off. The last 8 then is what's in the post-Cambrian period, or the Cambrian and beyond, and that's the 3 eras I think a lot of people are familiar with. The Paleozoic era is the era of fishes, and that lasted about 300 million years almost. Then there's the era that a lot of people know, the Mesozoic. That's the era of the dinosaurs. Then we had a big meteorite crash into the Earth near the Yucatan Peninsula, and that caused a great extinction events. And the a few dinosaurs that remained morphed into birds that we have today. But this is the era, the Cenozoic is then the era of mammals or the rise of the fur balls. The St. Croix history begins pretty early. It's all the way back to 1 billion years ago. And at that point, there was a continental rift here in the mid-continental regions where Minnesota is now located. And there were these, let's see, I'm gonna get my laser pointer here. These 3 plates were pulling apart, one to the south, one to the northwest, and one to the northeast. They rifted the area with the Lake Superior Basin sort of in the epicenter of all this stuff. And as they pulled apart, then magma welled up from below, spread out over the surface, created layers of basalt. Then when things cooled down, you got layers of sand and gravel on top of that, creating some sedimentary rock. And then the whole thing happened again with rifting apart and more magma being formed. So that sequence went on for some time, and it left these bowl-shaped depressions up in Lake Superior of the magmatic rocks down here, the volcanic rocks, with their brittle ends sticking up at Isle Royal in the northwest, and the south shore of Lake Superior, the Keweenaw Peninsula down here to the southeast. So that's the basic structure then of these bedrocks that form the very basement of what we have in the mid-continent area. These rocks are expressed as well along the St. Croix Valley because that's part of the rift. These are the basalt cliffs in the Dalles area down near St. Croix Falls and Taylor's Falls. And it's also mined in Dresser, Wisconsin. It's called trap rock there, but it's basically the same old basalt, black basalt rock, and that's ground up and used for transportation and construction purposes. So that's the first set of rocks, the rocks borne by fire. Then the next layer of rocks we dealt with are those borne by water, and those started really with the Cambrian along with multicellular life about 540 years ago, the Cambrian period, and then the Ordovician period, which followed that. These are sedimentary rocks that were laid down by a shallow ocean. You can see down here that, if you can, very southeastern Minnesota and southwestern Wisconsin were covered up by the shallow ocean here, the shallow sea, and that shoreline formed going up across southeastern Minnesota. With basement volcanic rocks down here, with the sedimentary rocks from the Cambrian and later eras on top of them, sandstones and limestones interbedded with some siltstones, which restrict some water flow. But the Prairie du Chien and Jordan layers, this is a fractured limestone, and the Jordan is a sandstone. These became the principal aquifers of the Twin City area for both water supply and irrigation. The Twin Cities themselves gets their water supply from the rivers, but all the surrounding areas, many of the outlying suburbs and all the smaller communities outside and really across this part of the state get their water from the Prairie du Chien and Jordan, and some maybe from some of the deeper ones, but these are the principal water supply aquifers. Here's a picture of these layers across the Twin Cities area. They also form a bowl-like structure, like Lake Superior, but these were formed because it was a depression to begin with, and they were filled in with these rock layers as the sedimentary rocks formed over time at the shoreline of this ocean. So here's the Hollandale Embayment again, and you see this feature here is, of course, a shoreline. And what do you get deposited along shorelines? You get not only seashells, but you get lots of sand. And the uplands that were feeding this sand, washing in from this part of the continent, were apparently rich in quartz, and these sands were very well rounded and of uniform size, and that makes them perfect for frac sand. And that's why we have all these frac sand mines. They're mining the sandstones that were born of this ancient shoreline here, stretching through southeastern Minnesota and southwestern Wisconsin or western Wisconsin, and partially all the way down to Ohio here and there. I'm not sure what's going on in Missouri, but these are that ancient shoreline here. from that ancient sea back in the early part of the Paleozoic. So we're covered up a lot of time in just the last few minutes, rocks from fire and then the rocks from water during the Paleozoic time. And the last deposits I'm going to talk about are the ones during our fur bowl time. They are the ones from the last ice age, the last 2 million years, more or less, maybe 2.5 or so. This is the ice age, and especially since the ice left, the 10,000 years to present, called the Holocene. So these deposits were laid down by the ice. Here's a picture of the ice at its full extent. The spreading centers up here in Hudson Bay, and in Greenland, and in the northern Baltic area, northern Scandinavia, some scattered across Siberia, montane glaciers in South America, and of course in Antarctica as well. The trigger of the glaciation is, I'm not so sure I know a lot about that, but something about the way ocean currents were modified 2.5 million years ago. But the pace of the glaciation itself was really made by the way the Earth orbits around the sun. You get glaciations about, or interglacials, about every 100,000 years, interspersed with long periods of ice over large portions of the North American, and although all of the northern continents here, both Eurasia and North America. A glacier moves by sliding across the ground and picking up materials. This is a glacier coming out of a montane area, but the idea is the same. This happened over the continents. The ice was about 1 kilometer thick or more, maybe 1.5 kilometers thick over the Minnesota area, and it slides forward and then melts at the snout here. And so as it melts, it releases all the sand and gravels and clays that it picked up by sliding over the earth behind it. And so these are deposited at the mouth, at the snout of the glacier, and carried away by meltwaters out here in front, which carry away which leave the coarse material behind and carry the fine sediment out farther. So it sorts the material into sands and silts and clays. So that's the way it works. It's always sliding forward and melting, and whether the glacier advances or retreats is just a matter about whether the sliding is faster than the melting or not. So a lot of the St. Croix was probably filled up with sand and gravel as the ice progressed and advanced over it. And then as the ice retreated, more sand and gravel was also deposited in front of the ice as it retreated. And it filled up a lot of the bedrock features today, and we still can find these buried valleys. Here's a picture, a map from the Geological Survey, Minnesota Geological Survey of Chisago County. You can see buried bedrock valleys here. This is the bedrock surface. The green are the lower units of bedrock. So these are cuts into the bedrock, and they feed the St. Croix out here. Wisconsin's over here to the east, and this is Chisago County here in Minnesota. So it's St. Croix trenches here, and these bedrock valleys were tributaries to the St. Croix. And this is the Sunrise River area. Here's a cross section through the area with Taylor's Falls has this upthrust of the basalts here, but all this area over here, the same transect here, has been this gray greenish stuff is glacial debris, sands, gravels, tills, clays and silts that were deposited on top of the bedrock by the advancing and retreating ice. And the sunrise is now way up on most of this, on top of the glacial debris, and only cuts down through it right near the St. Croix. You can see the same thing in Washington County. There are many tributaries to the St. Croix in these bedrock valleys leading to the deep bedrock trench that's the St. Croix today. And these bedrock valleys are all filled in with glacial debris, which means they had to be there before the glaciers got there. So they're older than the glaciers, and that means that the St. Croix trench itself is older than the glaciers because the tributaries had to be, they're younger than the St. Croix. So if they're filled in, then the St. Croix was as well. The ice didn't get much farther than Hudson, so this part of the St. Croix was never completely covered by ice during the last glaciation. Well, the question is, well, how did, if these areas are all filled in with glacial debris, how did the St. Croix itself become flushed of all these sediments? It's washed pretty clean of all the sand and gravels that once filled it. That has to do with the sequence of the way the ice advanced and retreated across North America. See here, this is the maximum extent of the ice across North America, and that tongue got all the way down to Des Moines, Iowa there. This was about, well, what did I say, 17,000 years ago or so, 15 to 17,000 years ago, say. And by 12,000 years ago, the ice had backed up to this part of the state, filled the Red River Valley here to the west, and the Superior Basin over here. The St. Croix drained that either through its current channel or through the St. Louis River here. And then this channel here is the Proto-Minnesota, also called the River Warren at that time. So this is carrying meltwater from the ice, and that meltwater is dirty because it's got lots of sediment that's melting out of the front of the ice. But by 1,000 years later, the ice, well, and that stuff, as I mentioned, completely filled up the St. Croix Valley and its tributaries. But by 1,000 years later, the ice had advanced or retreated, this much farther back to the north, leaving these large glacial lakes in front of the ice, dammed to the ice by the north and dammed to the south by watershed divides. So glacial Lake Agassiz out here to the west in the Red River Valley and farther north, all the way up to the Winnipeg area. And in the Superior Basin, there's glacial Lake Duluth. Of course, it got bigger as the Superior Lobe retreated. And instead of being dirty water, now this water was clean because all of the debris that's in the ice that melts out gets trapped in the lake that's in front of the ice. And the meltwater coming out of that lake is clean. And that makes it erosive. So all the sediments that were deposited in the River Warren and in the St. Croix, a lot of those sediments were flushed clean, especially in the St. Croix. These torrents of water coming out from meltwaters that were clean and washed all that sand and gravel down the Mississippi. What's the difference between these two valleys? They're quite different. The St. Croix was constrained by its bedrock trench that was there already. So it flushed out a narrow area with high energy, and all the sand and gravel that at one time filled it up. Sorry, clicked the wrong clicker here. This was all, what was filled in here has all been flushed out. And in contrast, the Minnesota was cut down into glacial material that consolidated. The sands, gravels, and clays and everything else was left behind when the ice retreated. So it created a very wide valley that meandered back and forth. The valley is miles wide, much larger than the Minnesota River would otherwise have carved itself. So these high flows of meltwater that were clean made a very wide river valley in the Minnesota area and a very narrow bedrock trench in the St. Croix. This St. Croix trench that was cleaned out had high energy water, and then that allowed these potholes to form by apparently having boulders get caught in depressions, and then they would, by turbulence, roll around and create these potholes over a couple thousand years of drainage here of very clean meltwater. But then what happened was the ice retreated further, which is not surprising, but it's treated enough further that the meltwaters no longer came south. They escaped to the north through the St. Lawrence Seaway, or perhaps to the Arctic Ocean through the Mackenzie Delta. That means that with no meltwaters going south, the only waters that were now coming down the Minnesota and the St. Croix rivers and Mississippi, where they come together, were just a trickle of the former selves. They were only carrying then the rain and snow melt and groundwater flow that they do now. So their flow was much, much reduced. That allowed the tributaries that fed into the Mississippi, then their sediments were no longer flushed away, and they could accumulate and they could dam the river. So what happened was the Chippewa River dumped a bunch of sediment into the Mississippi, and that backed up, created a dam that created Lake Pepin. Right here, here's the Chippewa coming in, and here's Lake Pepin, and here's the delta of all the deposits of the Chippewa, which dammed up the Mississippi, created Lake Pepin. Here's Lake Pepin, or there's the delta, and there's Lake Pepin today. And in fact, Lake Pepin probably went all the way up to St. Paul. Once the delta formed here and dammed the Mississippi, Lake Pepin almost certainly went all the way to St. Paul. There are lake deposits underneath all this area, and it dammed up probably the St. Croix as well. The origin dates for both Lake Pepin and Lake St. Croix are fundamentally the same time. About a little over 10,000 years ago is when the lowest radiocarbon dates in these lakes date out to. So they were probably formed about the same time by the same event, by the damming of the Mississippi by the Chippewa Delta. Let's see. Yeah, okay, we've already covered that. So in short, really, the St. Croix is an ancient depression. It was born of fire by the rifting in the continental areas and created this tectonic low area. That tectonic low area then allowed this shallow ocean during the Paleozoic times to fill in and lay down layers of sandstone and limestone. And then many years later, the glacial advances of ice created meltwaters that cut back down through these deposits and created bedrock valleys and channels in their current place here. And that in turn then, of course, led to the trench of the St. Croix that we see now today, the bedrock trench. So those are the three major features that created what we have under our feet now, the igneous rocks borne by fire, the sedimentary rocks created by water, and the glacial deposits all deposited by the ice and carried by them.
I'm so thankful it's raining. I won't feel antsy about being outside today. I thought I'd just feature some early spring bees in this short presentation. And what I've essentially done is I'm going to talk about all the bees that are coming out since the beginning of April this year. And the idea is to give you a sense of what bees are prominent in early spring, what their habitat may be. So I want to talk about some of the ground nesting bees as well as the cavity nesting bees. And I'm going to do my best to interweave some of the flowering plant phenology, because for many of our early spring bees, especially the solitary bees, there's a number of key habitat requirements that they need. Many are dependent on a single or very few plants. And so they need to have the ideal soil type to set up a nesting area, and then be in close proximity to those really critical key plants that they primarily forage on in the spring. And as you know, just going out and observing this time of year, we have very few things blooming right now. We have the beginnings of some of our woodland wildflowers, some of our early prairie species such as passflower, and of course some of our early shrubs and trees that I'll also be talking about. So I want to start off, and I know many of you already know this, but we have approximately 450 bee species in Minnesota, and native bees are very, very different than honeybees, which most people associate with behavior and nesting biology. So most of our native bees have a solitary nest. So a single female is either excavating a nest below ground or looking for a pre-existing cavity above ground. That could be in a plant stem or a hole in wood, for example. So many of our solitary bees, the 90% of the 450, many of them only produce one generation per year. So the life cycle from egg to adult is 12 months. And some of these early spring bees that I'll be featuring, if you find a nesting population, then you now can earmark that and return to the same site the following year at the same time to see the emergence of the next generation of that particular bee species. So for example, I'm going to start with featuring one of our earliest, or usually the first bee in Minnesota that we have that emerges in the spring, and it's the unequal cellophane bee. And it's a ground nesting bee. These bees, even though each individual female digs and excavates her own nest, they often nest in close proximity, especially again where they have ideal soil type. And so on my illustration on the left, what I'm trying to show you is, and nest architecture can be really variable depending on the ground nesting bee species. But essentially the female bee is excavating a main burrow, and from that burrow, radial or lateral shafts that each are provisioned as an individual brood cell. So those dotted lines that I'm showing are the way in which the bees, once they become adults and ready to emerge, they actually excavate their way vertically up to the ground surface. So the female or the mother, she backfills the nests and individual brood cells as she's constructing it. So the illustration, the actual bee larva or the next generation of adults produced, they don't follow that main burrow shaft as far as their exit strategy. They excavate vertically. So if you know where a nesting population is, the first thing that you can look for in early spring are the emergence holes. And that's what I'm showing in the middle image. They essentially look like circular holes in the ground. The difference between the emergence holes and the nests is that there won't be any soil piled around the nest entrance. So those emergence holes will be centered around where you perhaps had a nesting population the previous growing season. And with all of our native bees, or almost all of our native bees, the males come out of the ground or out of the cavity before females. And that can be anywhere from a few days to a week before females. And they essentially are setting up shop. And many of our native solitary bees will do patrolling. So you may see in a large nesting aggregation like this unequal cellophane bee, the males will come out of the ground and then they'll spend the next 2 to 3 weeks patrolling just above the ground. And what they're doing is they're looking for females or waiting for the females to emerge. So a lot of the time for these early spring species, mating occurs right there at the emergence sites or former nesting sites of their parents. And you'll see a lot of mating going on there, as well as in some of the first early flowering tree species and shrub species such as red maple or willow. So once the females have mated, they begin excavating a brand new nest that they will provision with pollen and nectar. And this particular bee species has pretty interesting nesting holes. They have a really large pile or tumulus around the nest entrance that it's really easy to spot once you've seen a population of these bees. So what do these early spring bees do, especially the males that come out a couple of days to a week before the females? And this year, some of the cellophane bee populations came out before we had that last snowfall. So the males have to have somewhere to shelter when it gets cool, or if it's raining, or if it snows, unfortunately. And so what they'll do is they'll tuck themselves back into those emergence holes around the nesting site, wait out the cool temperatures or inclement weather, and then come out typically when temperatures get over 50 degrees Fahrenheit to continue on with their mate patrolling activities. So the unequal cellophane bee, as I mentioned, likes to nest in large aggregations. So you'll often find many nests like I have in the left image lined up along a dirt footpath or on flat ground. The females really like well-drained soil, sandy or sandy loam soil. They will also have large nesting aggregations on grassy slopes or even on flat ground. And the females, once they've excavated their nest, you'll often see them perching at their nest entrance. And they're very, very shy. If you go and try and take a look down their nest entrance hole, they'll retreat back down into the nest. So I guess my message here is our ground nesting bees are not aggressive, and you can get up close and personal to all of these nest and mating activities, and you won't run the risk of getting stung. So that particular population that I just showed in the previous slide is at a local park in my neighborhood. And they, again, like the well-drained soil, but the other key thing for their habitat requirement is they need to be near a population of both red maple trees as well as early flowering spring willows. So hopefully my video is playing for everyone, and I'll wait a little bit longer if there's some lag time. But what all of that crazy bee activity is males patrolling the red maple flowers. So if they're not searching and patrolling around the emergence area in the ground, they will move on to these early flowering woody species like red maple or willow. Even now this week, you can go out and find patches of willows in full bloom. And if you look up high near the top of the willow shrubs, you'll see this kind of activity of different male species patrolling for females. So willows are a hot spot this time of year, especially in April. in Minnesota, and lots of males. All of that activity, males rarely will spend much time on the flowers. Their sole purpose in life is to find a female. And if mating hasn't occurred near the emergent sites, it will also be happening around these flowering shrubs and trees where the males are patrolling for females. And I just want to highlight the importance of willow. I know many of our willow species are aggressive and not suitable for smaller landscapes, but I encourage you all, if you have larger landscape or you're managing a large property, please think of ways that you can incorporate different willow species onto the property. The pollen is very nutritious for many of these early spring bees that are looking for both pollen and nectar. And the willow plants support 14 different pollen collecting specialist bees, including this beautiful, I think it's called the willow colored mining bee. Common names for bees aren't very, they're a mouthful in many cases, but Andrena andrenoides, and you may see these still out there. Females are just starting to collect pollen and begin excavating nests. Willow is also important. As Lori mentioned, she had a queen bumblebee fly into her head the other day. It was very likely a two-spotted bumblebee or Bombus bimaculatus. And those queens, when they've been hibernating all winter below ground, they come out in the spring, the first thing they need is calories. And so they're going to be looking for flowering plants such as willow, some of our early woodland wildflowers, Dutchman's breeches, in order to get the calories they need to do their nest searching activities and to develop and lay eggs. So willows are very important for both pollen and nectar, and it's a great place to, I say, set up shop with your camera. You'll see many of our early spring bees visiting the willow plants in spring. So right now, Bombus bimaculatus, especially in the Twin Cities area, is typically one of the first bumblebee species in Minnesota to come out in the spring. And they are, they do have, each bumblebee species has their own suite of plants that they prefer to visit. You'll find the two-spotted on some woodland wildflowers, such as Dutchman's breeches, but they will typically pass over earlier flowering plants like bloodroot, which they seem to have no interest in. The two-spotted right now, the violets are just starting to bloom, so you'll find some of the queen two-spotted bumblebees also visiting violets. It's a good reason to have some violets blooming in your lawn or in your shady plant garden. The next genus that I want to feature are the mining bees, and they are very prevalent in the spring. We probably have close to 100 species of mining bees in Minnesota. The three that I have featured in these images are part of a large subgenus, the Melandrina, and they're quite large. Many people mistaken them for small bumblebees, but they are doing a lot of the pollination of some of those woodland wildflowers I mentioned that bumblebees pass over. So you'll find them visiting bloodroot, and that same sort of male patrolling is happening around those early flowering plants like bloodroot. You'll see many bees flying around the flowers, but never landing on them. And they're typically all male mining bees waiting for a female to come to the flower to collect pollen. Some of our mining bees are very common in urban areas. So the one that's nesting in the lawn is the Dunning's mining bee. And it's very common in the Minneapolis and metro area. People find it right in the middle of their lawn or in their gardens. And again, willow, you'll find many different species of mining bees, not just the specialists, but some in this subgenus, the larger mining bees. So mining bees, many people say, well, how do I tell the difference between those cellophane bees and mining bees? Well, they are many of the species are similar in size. Both collect pollen fairly high up on their hind leg. Mining bees get the nickname the armpit bee, and you can see in that top image why they get that nickname. They not only have pollen collecting hairs on the upper part of their hind leg, but also on the side of their thorax. So it looks like they're carrying the pollen in their armpits. The main distinctive feature in those bottom 3 images that I'm trying to illustrate is the females especially have very large depressions on the inside of their compound eyes. And that's the first thing to look for if you take a photo, or if you're observing bees in early spring. You can often spot these facial depressions. And in many cases, they're filled with real short felt-like hairs that are a different color than the other hairs on the face. So they look like vertical, they're essentially vertical grooves on their face. And the males are much smaller than the females, and they have very blocky anvil-like heads. They're much skinnier, and you can see those really skinny hind legs because they lack the longer pollen collecting hairs that the females need to collect so that they can provision their nests. Many of the male mining bees have fancy mustaches, so they have a large cluster of hairs on the lower part of their face. If the mustache is absent, then they will have typically a white or yellow or brightly colored clypeus or section on their face. All right, I just want to touch on some of our early spring cavity nesting bees, and we have a number that do come out earlier in the spring. As I mentioned, most of all of our cavity nesting bees in Minnesota are pre-existing cavities. So that can mean holes in standing dead trees that I have illustrated here. It could mean holes in plant stems, or they're going to excavate parts of plant stems. So they're looking for some sort of hole that usually another insect has created. And the females the longer the cavity, the better. And that's an important tip to understand when people create supplemental bee nests or hotels. You want to make sure that those cavities are as long as possible, so that the female can provision many larvae inside of the cavity. The blue orchard mason bee is an early emerging bee that's a cavity nester. This is some images of some early males that were out this spring visiting red maple flowers. Again, the males come out before the females, and they are typically developing at the front of the cavity or the closest to the exit. So they come out first, followed by their sisters or the females that are developing at the back of the cavity. And this is a look inside an orchard mason bee nest. Each cavity nesting bee uses different natural materials to line the inside of their nest. And the orchard mason bee will collect mud. So you can see that not only the individual rooms are created with walls in the cavity, but the cavity itself, each cavity is lined with mud. And so that lovely pollen and nectar combination that the female orchard mason bee has provided for the bee larva, she's placed that in there, laid a single egg, and these images are showing different life stages or instars of the bee larva as it props itself up on the end of its abdomen and feeds on the pollen and nectar that their mother has provided. And finally, some of our other smaller cavity nesting bees that are out in early spring include some of the pith or stem nesting bees. And I posted this on Facebook last week, but I was walking at a local park, and I noticed this large area of raspberry canes that had been browsed by deer in the winter. The lower left image, it's not a great image, but what you're looking at is what used to be long arching canes, all sort of chomped down to about 24 inches in height. And so it's that natural disturbance of herbivore browsing that has provided all of these amazing nesting opportunities for some of these smaller cavity nesting bees, like the small carpenter bee. And so one of the things that we can do in our own landscapes to provide a number of different nesting opportunities is to cut the old flower stalks to 15 inches so that we're mimicking that herbivore browsing. So that's an image I took a couple of years ago in my yard, and the image was taken probably week or two ago, so because you can't see any plant growth. But I've cut them all back, and all of those cut end stems will be potentially excavated by the small carpenter bee, or we also have a type of mason bee, Hoplitus, that likes to use these pithy flower stalks. And so people often ask, well, when can I get rid of that stem stubble? And you don't, you leave it indefinitely. And again, the egg to adult life stage of many of our solitary bees is 12 months. So if I'm providing this stem stubble in April, and female adult Ceratina small carpenter bees are emerging, they're going to be excavating the pith out of that stem stubble, laying their eggs, and their larvae will be developing for the next 11 months and emerging in the spring of 2021. So leave it indefinitely, or just leave a little if you find it ugly. But it's a really simple way to provide a number of different nesting opportunities for the cavity nesting bees. And I apologize, with 20 minutes, I didn't do much of an introduction or conclusion, but I'd be happy to answer questions. And
thank you for joining us for today's Earth chapter. Thanks to Pollinator Friendly Alliance, our host, and Ramsey County Soil and Water, our co-host. If you have questions or inquiries, please contact pollinatorfriendly.org.